Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air this evening. With me is David Erasmus and Stuart Manins. I've got both of them here because I want to talk about the subject of time and what time means to each of us and how we go about understanding it from our Christianity. Is there something special about the way Christian theology works with the notion of time? So with that in mind, I'd like to share a quote from Immanuel Kant, and he said, "Science is organised knowledge," scientia, science, the Latin, and that's basically quite self-explanatory. Science is knowledge. He also said, "Wisdom is organised life, and life is lived through and in time and space." So the acquisition of wisdom is somehow an acquisition within time and space. So let's begin by, first of all, asking David, what do you make of this concept of time? What does time mean to you?
I can't help but be influenced by scientific reasoning, because unfortunately that's been a big part of my life. So unfortunately that's influenced as well, apart from the Christian influence. And that's of course been a very tricky subject over the years, and a lot of science has been on analysing time and seeing what it actually represents, from ideas that time only flows in one direction and that being refuted and all these kinds of things. So it is a bit of an anomaly. It's a bit of a curious thing that's hard to understand, and in fact has had a massive impact on recent discussions of cosmology, origins of the universe, and all this kind of thing, which in some senses plays quite nicely with some of the Christian concepts, which I like as well. The idea that there's a starting point to life, and there may or may not be an eternity flowing on from that. So there seems to be quite a strong coincidence or strong correlation between scientific ideas of time and religious ideas of time, particularly Christianity.
Well, that's quite an answer. There's a lot in there to be unpacked. Before we start unpacking that, Stuart, what does time mean to you in a personal sense?
It means different things. I try to understand the scientific discussions about it. I find the philosophic discussions from the work of Heidegger at the beginning of last century, and I can't understand really what he's talking about. But I do understand there's two different ways in my life of looking at time. One is the points that sort of add up, and there's another way of using time where it's a period. And to think of that, you need to think beyond time. In the same way, there's a way of thinking of space as beyond space. And this, to me, links up with my view of what I think God might be, and that's beyond personality.
Well, once again, there's so much in that we need to unpack. I wonder whether a really good starting point might be the parable of the wise and foolish young maidens preparing or not preparing for the wedding feast, which was a scripture reading we had this morning from the Common Lectionary. And why I say that is that that's a parable that quite firmly is set in the context of the idea that there will come an end to time. The wise and the foolish are separated by the fact that some have gone in to the kingdom, the banquet, the feast, but others are left on the doorstep. And the bridegroom, who should be welcoming, I guess, in our terms of culture, to all and sundry associated with the wedding, he's saying, "I didn't know you. You didn't come with me on the journey. You didn't have your lamps ready." And so it's marking a moment. It's set in a cluster of other parables that also mark a moment when it's expected that the kingdom of God will break through unexpectedly. The eschaton, the drawing to an end of time itself. And then the churches later on added the idea of parousia, the second coming. And we know from William Blake's illustration, for example, you've got the angel announcing on the trumpet that the second coming is nigh. And so the cluster of the wise and the foolish, and one group agitated and the other very calm. And I remember once there was a terrific natural disaster in America. This was 20, maybe 30 years ago. And it had been captured on video, one Christian woman running down the street, sort of deliriously happy amidst all the ruin and destruction, singing, "He's coming, he's coming." And to me, that seemed a very distorted notion of what the end of time might be and what the parousia, the second coming, might be. So with that in mind, I wonder whether you would say that an understanding of time and a drawing to an end of time, David, is an important concept for Christians to get hold of.
That's a bit of a tough one. I would say, unfortunately, in my perception, there's a lot of misinformation, I feel, in connection with this concept of the end of time. There's a lot of things around it which I think are more misleading and not particularly helpful. I personally feel there's a strong feeling, there's a sense that each one of us goes through a life where our life begins at a particular point. Time seems to change with us as we age and move through our lives. And we have a very personal feeling of time, and that time comes to an end. And we all know that's going to happen. And that sort of is a representation of what happens as we see to the world. And that's how we perceive the world. And that's in a sense how I understand that concept.
Do you feel that you understand your past? Do you have access to your past, personal past?
Not in the sense that you can change it, I hope, because I don't have a time machine. I can't go back to it. Yes, in a large sense, your past defines you.
It's often said that we are our memories, and our memories are something in the past.
Yes.
But I was very helped by this idea of what, I think I'd call it the wall of time, and Augustine talks about windows in the wall of time. When you look at, say, some of the statues that were carved by the Renaissance sculptors, some of them are still half-formed. The figure is emerging from the stone, and it's as if the backdrop of that stone is part of the wall of time. When we look back on events that have passed, including our personal past, we can't alter it, but we see different figures emerging from that wall at different times, and it's as if, and I stress it in a personal sense, it's as if this wall of time is a completed event. But the wall of time itself keeps advancing forward. You mentioned the arrow of time. Now, have physicists or scientists ever been able to suggest that you can reverse the arrow of time?
Well, yes, indeed, because in fact, the fundamental laws of physics don't have anything in it which by definition would imply that it has to flow one way or the other. So the equations themselves would work both ways. I'm a little bit rusty here, but I have actually read things of where in concepts there is a possibility of things going forwards and backwards. To take one particular example, the idea of photons moving through a diffraction plate, where you could, in theory, have a particular particle going through two different plates, two different slits in the plate, and being in two different places at the same time, or being in two different times in the same place, kind of thing. So there are all those things around which could imply that time could flow in a different direction. I'm not saying that we will ever experience that, because I think psychologically we are designed to flow, and our time is supposed to flow in one direction.
The arrow of time goes in only one direction in terms of biological life.
Indeed, yes.
I think that the way into understanding this is the second law of thermodynamics.
Yes.
That suggests things tend towards the entropy, maximum randomness, and yet, though that is a fundamental law of physics, the reality of the universe is quite the opposite, because this planet has formed life and it's flowing in ever more complex directions. Now, you might want to say, oh, but across the whole universe, everything's sort of becoming more and more chaotic and disorganized and moving towards that final extinction. But the Big Bang itself has set up different kinds of laws that have aggregated matter in ways that don't suggest randomness. So I think there may be something harder to grasp about the arrow of time itself. But Stuart, that's where I wanted to bring you in. Do you see an arrow of time in your life, in your lifespan of 85 years? I know that you said you couldn't or didn't want to change things, but in that arrow of time, has it been an inexorable arrow? Has time and free will somehow become intertwined?
Yes, I do, and I'd be hard-pressed to try and explain to you clearly what the relationship was. But you mentioned a few minutes ago the phrase "as if," and I feel, for me, there's great comfort if I don't understand things completely. Like, I can't think of an edge to space, and I can't think comfortably with a beginning to time or an end to time. I'm not sure what people mean by eternity. But many years ago, a very wise lady said to me, when we were talking about these things, she said, well, my way of looking at it is this: I live as if, using your phrase again, as if I'm going to live forever, with the possibility I might die tomorrow. Now, I find that very comforting. I don't have to understand really complex concepts, but it can give me a purposeful and a positive way of living my life.
I think also Jung stressed that he said we must live as if we will live forever in order to be able to really live. And in some ways, that's a very difficult saying when you look at the complexity of the world and all the people who have no chance, little children, people dying of disease, etc. They have no shot at a tomorrow. They can't live as if there were an unlimited supply. But I think for those that are able to, Jung is quite correct that we mustn't think of our life as on any kind of journey but an arrow that will keep going forever on. But at some point, we're going to be like those figures that are coming out of the stone. We become frozen in time past, but the wall of time keeps going forward. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I can accept that. What you're saying is we must live as if we go on forever with this thing. But I like adding to that, but be prepared for anything as if we're dying tomorrow.
Yeah, okay. So let's focus in on the understanding that comes from science now, because I think this is absolutely critical to Christian theology. You go all the way back into Greek thought, Greek philosophy, or if you looked at Hindu religious thought, you would find that people believed that history went through cycles. It was never ending, but there was a circular flow to history. So you moved around the circle, and this was an infinitely repeating pattern. They didn't conceive of there being a start and an end. That is the peculiar genius of the Hebraic way of thinking. The Jewish genius is that insists there is a start. You know, the problematic verses of Genesis, in the beginning, God created, implies that time has a definite beginning, a definite starting point. When you've got that, it's not so difficult to start to think maybe there will come an end to this notion of time. So time is like a finite line or finite arrow. It's moving inexorably forward, but it has a point at which it started, a point at which it will end. Now, that's in complete contradistinction to the idea that we're in eternal cycles of history. And the beginning of modern science actually starts with the Christian monks, the schoolmen, people like Thomas Aquinas, trying to understand that Hebraic concept of the beginning and the end of time. And as they develop their mathematics, they begin to understand that there are concepts like zero, which was there in Indian philosophy and mathematics. That zero is derives from the Arabic word for zephyr, as light as the lightest of light breezes. It's not there. So you start to think about things that have no weight, they have no number that you can measure their length. They have no number that you can measure their time. They're as light as the zephyr, but you have a number that defines it, zero. And to the medieval mind, this was mind-blowing. It literally blew apart all the philosophy that had gone before. And at the same time, they began to develop a concept of the infinite. And zero and infinity become the key concepts around which the notion of time, beginning and end, starts to develop. With this development, science can really get going. It defines, I think it was Stanley Waiake, Roman Catholic priest, a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Opinionated Roman Catholic priest. He won the Templeton Prize for his work in the origins of science, and he says science was stillborn in China, it was stillborn in India, it was stillborn in the Greek worlds, and those are the worlds that influence Christianity, until you get zero and infinity and the Christian schoolmen, Thomas Aquinas, etc., you don't have anything approaching science. So for Waiake, science gets going when they start to talk about zero and infinity. And as soon as you've got the concept of infinity, then you then have a problem with the word that you use, Stuart, eternity. Yeah. What is eternity? Well, let me ask you straight out. Do you believe that you're going to live for an infinite length of time after you've died?
Well, I don't know. It's my honest answer.
I think that would be everybody's honest answer.
We don't know, do we?
We don't know. But what matters is what I do with the moment that I'm living in now.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Now, this has its parallel in the mathematical formulations. The idea of a limit. There's a limit to our knowledge. There's a limit to our knowledge of what infinite life might. We may hope for it, we may not want it at all, but there is a limit to our knowledge. And in many respects, the two things run in kind of parallel. The differential limit in calculus, you keep on getting closer and closer to an answer, but you cannot actually get there. And yet, you assume that you can get there, and the whole of scientia, the whole of mathematics rather, falls, the whole of the calculus falls into place. Let's be reasonable. The whole of the calculus falls into place because you make assumptions about what happens when you approach zero and end up at infinity. Now, these are concepts that the average congregation has zero knowledge of. And that worries me. I mean, I don't believe that they should all become mathematicians, but when you think about it, the one thing that we've all got in common in any Christian congregation, or we've all got in common as human beings in the world, is that we must live in time and space. And yet we have the most incomprehensible ideas about time and space. Personally, we tend not to develop them because they're too hard. I think that's right. You said you don't know, and I think they're very, very difficult to develop.
Can I say another thing too?
Yeah.
And that is, I think this is moving towards truth, what one thinks of truth. Because once you think you've arrived at it, it means you've closed your mind. And one of the things that I think both religion and science need is to have an open mind. We can get as near as, it's like the horizon. You can travel and get closer to the horizon, but you never quite get there. And if you're demented enough to think you've arrived at the horizon, well, you're nuts.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a good definition of infinity, if you like.
You're nuts. David, you did mathematics, and it's, the mathematical way of thinking has been part of your world of business, if you like, for a long time. But it would be fair to say that these are also questions that really don't get traversed in the average mathematics degree.
No, I think that's true. I think for example, one of the things you just touched very briefly on there is the idea, which is founded in good science and in sense in good religion as well, is the idea that each of us have our own time. And it's not just that you have a personal sense of time; it's that you have your own clock, if you like, which defines where you go. And this is all been defined by Einstein's theory of relativity, that as you move, and of course the faster you move, the more your clock changes relative to other people. And this idea we have in normal life that time is fixed is of course not true, that your time changes as you move around and as you move towards more heavy objects or not. I believe that you could think of it if you had two twins and one lived on the coast and one lived up on a big mountain which was heavy, that the time would be slightly different for the two of them because of the effect of gravity. Now, of course, these don't have an implication for us for normal life on Earth because the scale is just not big enough to show it. But it's actually a good, I think, religious concept to think of, this idea that for each of us we have a personal concept of time, a personal space in which we live. And I think that is in some cases defined by our relationship with God and with the relationship we have with other people.
I think that's a really helpful way of looking at it. There's this difference between objective time and subjective time, personal time and the time out there. There's also another religious truth that strengthens that argument, and it's a Greek word, Kairos. And the Kairos moment is meaning the right moment, the right time at which to take certain actions in life. And Kairos moments are very, very rare. When they come, you tend to know in an inward kind of way that this is the right moment. Or when a society takes a Kairos moment, and one wonders in the recent election, despite all the things that are said about all the parties, whether each of them was trying to seize a Kairos moment. And it didn't happen in the way that people expected it to happen. I'd like to ask both of you to give me, please, your feeling about whether you have enough time in life to fulfill your purpose.
Well, I think that's a slight extension on what I just said, that you have this idea of personal time, and it appears, and it's obviously just a psychological effect, it seems as if time is speeding up as you grow older. And I think this is something a lot of people experience, is it seems like there always seems to be less time to do what you want to do. That's not helpful, I know.
No, I think that's very helpful.
I think it depends on your attitude to life. You can either go about saying, I've never had enough time to do the things I want to do, or you can say, I'm happy in doing what I can, when I can, and that's enough for me.
Yeah.
I tend to be that side.
Which is great.
Philosophical.
Oh, that's very practical.
I've got another question, and it's one that is very close to me personally. I grew up in an age when television was starting to become part and parcel of New Zealand home life. So when I can't remember, maybe I was 8 or 7, something like that, we got a television. And it was very close to when they first started broadcasting. I think it was 6 o'clock in the evening, if memory serves me correctly, and they broadcast for about an hour or an hour and a half. We got a TV set at home not long after that. And a little bit later on, one of the first programs that I developed a real passion for, I suppose it would be 4 or 5 years on from that, was Doctor Who. And Doctor Who has been through any number of personal time reincarnations, and has also been through, I think it closed down for a bit and then they reinstituted it, etc. And our difficulty talking about time was never an issue in the scripts of Doctor Who. He was the Lord of Time who moved freely doing this. The arrow of time didn't exist for Doctor Who. And in recent series, part of Doctor Who's problem is that because he can move backwards and forwards, he's always having to undo the things he did in the past to stop something else happening in the future. And I wonder whether the next generation down, they've grown up with a different kind of understanding in relation to not just Doctor Who, but a whole lot of science fiction, a whole lot of fantasy novels, fantasy television, gaming, etc. Do you think it's possible that they have a better understanding of time than we do because of exploring it more in fiction?
Are you going to take that?
I'll take time to listen.
You think a generation which is very, let's say, computer focused, or let's say computer games, would that improve your sense of time? That's a very tough call. I don't know whether that's true or not.
They may have, let me rephrase it, they may have a greater relish for discussing the issues of time than the reluctance of, within Christian congregations, because fiction has enabled them to think more constructively about it.
That's probably
that makes sense to me.
That makes sense, yeah.
Although, David, I belong to a generation, I think probably 20 years before yours. You had the first television experiences. In our street, we had the first telephone and the first radio and the first fridge. So all our neighbours came in for phone calls to listen to Fred and Maggie Everybody on the radio, which might be the equivalent of yours, and to leave perishable goods in our fridge. Now, because of that, I think I didn't develop an interest in Doctor Who. For me, the magic of that outside communication was music. And I heard things that I'd never heard in an evangelical church and were never likely to hear, well beyond my aesthetic sensitivities. And that really grabbed me. and I did without Doctor Who.
Well, you had an incomplete life, Stuart.
I know, I know. I have still an incomplete life, for which I'm very grateful.
Well, I think you're absolutely on the button there. The magic of radio did it prior to television, and people would tune in regularly for weekly broadcasts that were around fiction. And that, to me, is another clue. It leads all the way back to the fact that Jesus told parables, and some of those parables have this element of time and right time, and the time is now about them. And I wonder whether that's the thing that the church has lost, the ability to tell stories, be they fiction or non-fiction, scientia or imaginative stories. Whichever, we've lost the ability to tell these stories. So that's why we don't discuss the nature of time.
Now that speaks to me, because I remember a particular storyteller on Saturday mornings, a man called Kenneth Melvin. Probably never heard of him, but he had a program called Tusitala, Teller of Tales. Oh, you've heard of that. And I listened spellbound to that man, and developed for my whole life a care for following stories, making stories, telling stories, and teaching through stories. And then when I look back at what Jesus did, or Socrates, or Aesop, and I find that's a well-worn path.
Very much so. Tusitala, Simon,
yes,
first applied to Robert Louis Stevenson.
Yes, that's right.
The Teller of Tales, yeah. Well, I think we're coming very close to drawing the time of this broadcast to a close. And I'd want to come back to St. Augustine's incredible insight. This idea that there are windows within the walls of time. And Augustine said that God created the universe. God painted the universe with time. And whether we tell the stories of science or whether we tell the stories of the Tusitala, it's about how we can imaginatively enter in to those stories and allow our passage through the story, through the time of the story, to alter the passage of our lives through our own personal subjective time. That would be my understanding of why we should do it.
And that's my understanding of communicating the gospel. Exactly that.
Any final comment from you, David?
No, I think that's quite a good ending. It's quite a good way of summarizing one's feeling about it. And I'm just wondering, referring back to what you said earlier about younger people living in a computer-based world, that a lot of them are doing games which are based on stories fundamentally, and they're living within a story, which is even taking things a step further.
Wouldn't it be great if a much greater number of Christian and Jewish values were somehow incorporated into those stories that enabled them to find and discover for themselves? Thank you both very much for coming in. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I know it was a difficult task, but it does make my page on time travellers all the more interesting when this video goes up.